Okay. Evening again, Council. Well, not evening again, but hello again. Nice to see everybody back again. I'm missing Councillor Fitzgerald. Crystal, can you confirm whether he's in the waiting room or?
He's being brought into the meeting right now.
Great, thank you. There he is. Okay, I would like to call the meeting to order and welcome everyone to the meeting tonight. This meeting is being held electronically in accordance with Section 238 of the Municipal Act 2001. The procedures for the meeting are as per the town's procedural bylaw and the electronic meeting protocol. I can confirm that we have everyone present tonight, and that gives us quorum. And I would like to read the land acknowledgement statement to get us going tonight. I would like to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe under the terms of the Robinson-Huron Treaty 61 of 1850 and the Williams Treaties of 1923. We commit to acknowledge, learn, educate, create opportunity, honor sacred places, and take actions towards real truth and reconciliation in support of our commitment to walking the path together in respect, peace, and harmony for future generations. I have a motion moved by Deputy Mayor Alcock and seconded by Councillor Weed. Be it resolved that the special council meeting agenda dated Wednesday, October 27th, 2021 be adopted as printed and circulated. All in favor? That carries. Are there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, we will move right into our invited presentation from Paul Lowe's and David Riley, SGL Planning and Design.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of council. My name is Paul Lowe's with SGL Planning and Design. My business partner, David Riley, will be joining shortly. Unfortunately, he's stuck in another public matter, committee of adjustment matter, and he's trying to get out of it shortly. So he, if he joins me, he'll take over at part of the presentation, but I'll start the presentation, Madam Mayor.
Okay.
So if we can have the presentation up, then I can get going on it.
Thank you. I will share the screen. Before I start doing that, through you, Madam Chair, if I could just provide a brief introduction.
That'd be great. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, perfect. So as you've already heard, the report before you today is for information purposes only and addresses the first draft of the community planning permit bylaw for this public meeting. And to support this public meeting, we have invited representatives from SGL Planning and Design, including David Riley and his colleague, or sorry, Paul Lowe's and his colleague David, who's currently late. Also with us today, we have representatives from Dillon Consulting, including
Mayor Terziano.
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. There was a blurb you needed to say before Mr. Clark spoke.
I just realized that. Thank you. I just thought I'd let Richard finish his introduction and then I will go back.
Sorry.
No problem. Go ahead, Richard. Continue on.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So as I was just saying, also with Dillon Consulting, we have Annie Boulez and Daniel Hoang, who are part of the consulting team helping the town on this project and are available to answer questions should the need arise. So as you're aware, the draft community planning permit bylaw is a planning bylaw that the town is developing to help implement Huntsville's 2019 official plan. It will affect the entire municipality in terms of its geographic scope and will replace the existing zoning bylaw and site plan control bylaw upon completion. This is possible because the bylaw, as you'll hear, will take advantage of tools contained in the Planning Act that allows these separate bylaws and tools to be combined into one to help streamline the development approval process. So David is going to provide the presentation regarding the proposed bylaw, how we got to this point, and the next steps. And David, who is late, will be joining and will take over the presentation when he's able. They'll also be reviewing the written comments received to date, which were forwarded to you all earlier today. And so with your permission, we'll turn the floor over to Paul, and he can walk us through that presentation, of course, after you provide the information you're supposed to. Thanks.
Thanks, Richard. And if you'll just give me a minute, Paul, I missed a little blurb here. I'd like to welcome everyone to the public meeting to present and receive feedback on the first draft of the town's proposed community planning permit bylaw pursuant to Section 34 of the Planning Act. The procedure to be followed in these meetings will be as follows. A brief explanation of the purpose and effect of the proposed bylaw and any correspondence received to date will be given by staff and invited presenters from SGL Planning and Design. Any members of the public present will then be permitted to ask questions or provide comments respecting the proposed community planning permit bylaw. Council will then have the opportunity to question the staff or anyone giving presentations. Once the public meeting is concluded, the input received will be considered with updates to the proposed bylaw made as appropriate. Any persons making representation are required to first state their name and mailing address, and please note that the presentations are limited to 10 minutes. You can tell this is my first public planning meeting. Please be informed that the appellant must provide an oral submission at the public meeting or written submission prior to the passage of the procedural bylaw. Otherwise, the Ontario Land Tribunal may dismiss the appeal. If you wish to be notified of the passage of future public meetings for this bylaw, you must file with the clerk a written request for notification prior to the passage of the proposed bylaw. Now, Paul, thank you for your patience, and you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor. If Richard could cue the presentation. It's a fairly lengthy presentation, Madam Mayor, but we figure we should be all-encompassing and fairly detailed because it's such a new planning tool for the municipality. So with your indulgence, I'll try and go through fairly quickly, but I do want the public to understand the process we've been in and the bylaw. So I'll be exploring a fair amount today. So if we could start the next slide, please. This is just the slide to say the team, and I think Richard already discussed the team that was working on the bylaw. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what I want to do as I go through the presentation is talk a little bit about the overview of the project, an overview of the community planning system. I'll call it the CPPS in short, versus a zoning bylaw. What we've heard to date in terms of some of the public comments on our open house and stakeholder meetings. And then what we really spend a lot of time on is reviewing the draft bylaw and then summarizing further steps in the process. Next slide, please. The next slide on the project overview. So you see where we are now is in phase 4, which is the bylaw preparation. We had a discussion paper that was presented that was completed at the end of last year and had some public consultation in the spring. That was in phase 3. We're here now with the bylaw preparation with at the end of that phase, which we'll be doing another public meeting later on, which I discussed later on, and then we'll go into the approval stage and the next step. Next slide, please. So now I just talk a little bit about what a community planning permit system is. It's really a tool, another planning tool, a slightly different planning tool available under the Planning Act. A number of municipalities are starting to use it, have been using it. Lake of Bays has been using it on their waterfront for many years, and one of the first, and they started with what was called a development permit system. The province has changed it to a community planning permit system. Same, just a slightly different name. And it replaces zoning bylaw, and also can replace the site plan control and a number of other tools that we have. So next slide, please. What are the benefits? Well, as I said, it combines a number of tools into one. So zoning, site plan, minor variances are captured by it, so there wouldn't be a separate minor variance process. It leads to shorter approval times and allows the municipality to impose certain conditions with an approval. Those conditions then have to be addressed before the final approval is made. And it adds predictability, sorry, I can't speak tonight, to the process for the public and for applicants. Next, and there's no third-party appeals on an application for a permit. Next slide, please. So just quickly, we've created this little table to identify what the difference between a community planning permit system is and a zoning bylaw. A community planning permit includes 3 classes of approvals, and we'll be going over those classes versus a zoning bylaw and separate site plan process. It allows for incorporation of urban design concepts into the consideration of a permit. It doesn't require mandatory public meetings as part of a development application as mandatory public meetings are as part of the zoning bylaw, but there will be a public process, which we'll talk about. There are no third-party appeals, as I indicated, but there are appeals under zoning bylaw process, and approval time is 45 days after complete application versus 3 months generally for a zoning bylaw amendment. Next slide, please. This 2 slides kind of shows the traditional process at the top and the community planning permit system at the bottom. What's the really key point is the area in the box, the pink kind of box in the middle, and it shows how it's collapsing all of those different separate processes in the top and the traditional process into one community planning process, permit process through the new system. So which includes site alteration permits, tree removal permits, site plan approval, minor variances, zoning, all collapse into one process. Next slide, please. So just wanted to cover off what we heard. We've had a number of meetings with the public, including recently. The project website is on my Huntsville engagement page, provided information. There's been newsletters throughout the process. We had an online survey and an interactive mapping tool that we've reported on. We've had a number of stakeholder meetings and workshops through the process, and we've had an open house a couple of weeks ago. Next slide. But we did a survey, and some of the questions in the survey, which I'll just discuss. We had a vision in the bylaw prepared, and we asked respondents what they thought of the vision. And you see that the majority agreed or strongly agreed with the elements of the vision, which is that Huntsville is a vibrant, caring, and welcoming community. We're stewards of our natural environment, arts, culture, and heritage. We value a strong and resilient economy. Growth will continue and be sustainable and balanced with the public interest and the impact of our quality of life. So it's well received, that vision. Next slide, please. The top 3 topics that the public felt were most important to be addressed in the bylaw. Shoreline controls were the top. Natural heritage feature protection was very important, as well as natural hazards, tree removal as well. Next slide, please. We asked about public notification because there are different ways to notify the public. About half the respondents support not receiving notification if a development meets the general requirements of the bylaw. And we'll be talking about a little bit about the classes of the bylaw. So that really is class 1. So half the residents, respondents felt that they didn't need to receive notification if under class 1. Over 60% support only receiving notification of a development includes a variance, which would be a class 2 or class 3 permit, and slightly less would like to be informed of a development regardless of who approves. So we have staff approval and council approval, which I'll be describing. Next. We also heard, just to summarize some of the more general comments, there was appreciation of a more streamlined process and understanding the benefits to the public of that process. There was concern for the opportunities of appeal, and there was also discussion on notification process. Some of the main priorities were greater enforcement for shoreline erosion, protection of lakes, water quality, and urban design. Next slide, please. Other themes we heard was protection of natural resources and the environment, providing opportunities for public feedback and notification in the process, appreciation of the reduced timelines, balancing the efficiency of a new system without compromising proper reviews. Largely that revolves around a shorter review period that I mentioned, that 45 days. And there was also a discussion of removing barriers for affordable housing and opportunities for provision of tiny homes. Next slide, please. So let me go over, that's kind of what we've heard to date. I'd like to go over a little bit of the bylaw itself, which is going to be the bulk of the presentation. And I want to get into a fair amount of detail. This first slide just shows the process we went through to create the bylaw, which has been a fairly in-depth process. Back from we had the discussion paper, we reviewed extensive best practices of what other development permit and community planning permit bylaws have undertaken, and then we prepared this draft bylaw. Next slide, please. So I want to just walk council and the public through the various sections of the bylaw. So the first section is explanatory notes section 1, and it sets out the basis for the bylaw, provides a bit of an overview of what a community planning permit system is, just so the public can understand that. And what we've also added is to help the public in understanding the bylaw is how to read this bylaw. So most people, the majority of people haven't read a zoning bylaw, but very few people have ever seen a community planning permit system bylaw. So it's like a recipe for somebody to picking the bylaw up and trying to understand the bylaw, how to read that, how to understand it, how to walk their way through. So if I have this property, I want to do this, how do I figure out where do I look in the bylaw for it? So we figure that's a very important section. We've tried to put in all our zoning bylaws and now looking at it in CPPS bylaws. Next slide, please. This is the next section. Section 2 is administrative section, and it sets really some of the more administrative aspects on really how the CPP permit system is going to work. It says when a permit is required and when it's not, and I'll get into that a little later. Establishes the classes of permits, class 1, 2, and 3, and the process for variations, and we're going to describe what that means of variations. Basically, class 1 involves no variations to what's in the bylaw. Class 2 and class 3 allow for certain variations and a different approval process, whether it's a class 2 or class 3, depending how extensive the variation is. Also sets out a process for provisional approvals and sets out exemptions. Next slide, please. I just want to walk through a little bit of what the classes mean when I mentioned classes. And so what we have is 3 classes, as I had mentioned. Class 1 is where all the development standards are met. So similar to a zoning bylaw, we have standards for precincts, and I'll go over that. But where an application meets all of those requirements, then it's a class 1, and it's approval by staff. So it's a fairly straightforward approval process, making sure that everything is met. And if it is, then it's approved. A class 2 is where there are certain variations met. So, for instance, maybe the side yard doesn't meet the requirement of the bylaw, or maybe it doesn't have enough frontage on the property. Then the applicant needs a variance to it, and a certain percentage variance would be a class 2. So, for instance, well, you know what? I'll get into that in the next slide. I'll discuss that a little bit more. And class 3 is where a more substantial variation, or sorry, class 2 would be approved by staff. Class 3 would be more substantive variations required, and it would be approved by council and considered by council. Next slide, please. So just going over the variations and what that means. I was just getting ahead of myself on the previous slide. So the bylaw establishes thresholds for the variation. So for each provision in the bylaw, it sets what the variation could be. So a class 2 variation has a certain threshold, certain percentage. So for instance, let's go to a lot frontage requirement, as I indicated. If you're proposing a reduction in lot frontage, so your property that you're proposing has a less frontage than required, and if that frontage is less than a 20% variation, then it would be a class 2 permit, and that could be considered by staff and approved or refused by staff. If it's greater than a 20% reduction in the required frontage, then it becomes a class 3 variation, and it would be subject to council approval. And if there is a controversy on the application, staff can also bump any of the class 2 variations up to council, so council can make that decision. And the bylaw also sets out a number of criteria for considering variations. And so whether it's staff or council consideration, those variations are reviewed against the evaluation criteria that's set out in the permit. Next section, next slide, please. Thank you. So a few examples of some of the criteria that I mentioned include the proposal is appropriate for the lands, takes into account the unique characteristics of the property and surrounding land uses. It's compatible with those. It fits into the character of the surrounding area. The proposal is consistent with the provisions of the bylaw. It's consistent with applicable policy documents like the official plan, conforms that official plan. The proposal creates no adverse impacts, or if there's any potential impacts, they can be avoided or mitigated so that through mitigation, there is no adverse impacts. Next slide, please. I just then want to walk you through a little bit of the process. Now, this chart here before you go, oh my gosh, Paul, that is a complicated chart, and those words are so small I can't read it. But I'm going to walk you through each of those. We've created this chart to help the public understand it. It's in section 212 of the bylaw, and it's really a step-by-step of how you get through the process. So I'm going to break that down in the next couple of slides. So we go to the next slide. That's the first step. The first step is preconsultation, which is required now for a zoning bylaw amendment or a site plan approval. You have to come to staff and have a pre-consultation meeting, and it'll be the same for the new bylaw. You meet with the staff and any other agencies, discuss what you're proposing. Staff prepares a checklist of any studies that need to be submitted with your application. and they determine whether it's going to be it's a Class 1, Class 2, or Class 3 permit. Those classes that I already discussed previously. Next, if we can go to the next slide. So the next slide is step 2, and this is the application submission. Excuse me. So the applicant will then submit the permit, including the checklist requirements and all studies that are required as part of that checklist, to the municipality. Then the staff and the agencies review that and provide any comments. Once all comments are made, and then the application is deemed complete. After it's deemed complete, if it's a Class 1 variation, a Class 1 permit, there's no notification required. It goes right through to staff review. If it's a Class 2 permit, then notification is required. Staff will prepare the notice and post on the town's website. The applicant is required to post a notice on their property, and any concerned individuals can submit comments within 15 days, as indicated. If it's a Class 3 permit, their public notification is required, following the same notification process as the Class 2 variation, but with the added requirement to notify all property owners within 120 meters of the property, similar to the requirement for a zoning bylaw amendment process. Next step, please. Sorry, next slide and next step. The next step is the application review. So for a Class 1 application, if there's no significant issues, then it proceeds to a decision. If there are any concerns, then the comments are discussed with the applicant, and any revisions that are required are made. So it's a fairly as I said, it's a fairly straightforward process on a Class 1. Class 2, again, if there's no significant issues are raised by staff's review, then it's approved by staff. If there are significant issues, then there's the potential for referral of the application to council to a Class 3 approval process. And under Class 3, then the application is forwarded to council with a presentation to planning committee, and where the decision process is made by planning committee with recommendation to council, similar to a zoning bylaw amendment process. Next slide, please. And then the final step is the decision step. So there's 3 different decisions that could be made. One is outright approval, and application could be registered on title, particularly if there's a site aspects that need to be registered on title, similar to a site plan approval. And then the applicant proceeds to building permit. A provisional approval is one where either staff or council approve it, but subject to some conditions. And those conditions need to be fulfilled before then they can proceed to the building permit, and if there's an agreement that has to be registered on title. And the third is refusal by either staff or council, and then the applicant may appeal that decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal, similar if they were turned down on a zoning bylaw amendment. Just a couple more aspects under administration, and then I'm going to turn it over to David. Provisional approvals, as I indicated, the bylaw sets out a process by which you can have provisional approvals and what those are. Those are the conditions I mentioned. So you can approve it with conditions, which is a provisional approval. And those conditions must be addressed within 1 year of the provisional approval being granted. The applicant can ask council for an extension, but that must be made within the 1 year. Some examples, the staff or council may say, well, this is good, but we need a landscape plan, or we need another study that we hadn't asked for. If you could do that, then you'll get your approval. Next slide, please. So I want to just talk about exemptions, because not all matters have to go through the development permit system. There are a number of process, a number of things that you can do on your property that don't require a community planning permit. And I just like to outline those here. Interior renovations, similar to zoning bylaw amendment, zoning bylaw, where and any interior renovations or changes to the interior of your house that don't require a planning permit. Minor repairs, maintenance, replacement does not require a community planning permit. Vegetation removal for forestry operations, in rural precincts outside of natural heritage, for personal use for firewood, heating, don't require a community planning permit. Seasonal water structures, agriculture uses and buildings in the rural precinct, and single detached dwellings located outside the waterfront precinct. In the waterfront precinct, they do need a permit. Outside, they don't. And next section, please. I'm going to turn it over to David to go through the rest of the bylaw definitions, general provisions, and the precincts.
Great, thanks, Paul. And hello, everybody. This is David Riley from SGL Planning. Thanks for passing it over to me, Paul. So yeah, we're looking now in the definition section of the draft bylaw, and generally we've carried over definitions from the existing bylaw, and we've made some additions and clarifications where we thought were needed, and also based on feedback we received from town staff on their experience implementing the zoning bylaw and the existing zoning bylaw. So we've made those improvements. So some of these changes include new definitions for natural features within the town's natural heritage system. Also some updates with respect to various dwelling types. So, clarifying maybe there's currently a definition for townhouse, but there's different types of townhouses. There's some that are part of condos, which would be called as block townhouses. So we've identified a definition for that. And also we've provided clarification for certain definitions and we think improvements for for example, the definition of floor area. Next slide, please. And so Section 4 of the bylaw is the general provisions section. And these are provisions that are applicable to all precincts within Huntsville. And they address matters such as, setbacks from water courses, regulations for specific uses permitted within the precincts, and many regulations related to vegetation removal, site alteration, and other matters. So generally, we've carried forward many of these provisions from the existing zoning bylaw, and we've updated and simplified provisions where appropriate. And now I just wanted to highlight a few other things, new things that have been included within this section on general provisions. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Variations to, just wanted to highlight with anything within the general provisions section 4 of the bylaw, you can also vary those provisions. And we've added a provision that says that variations to any of the provisions are subject to a Class 2 permit, so staff approval, unless otherwise specified. The general provisions also addresses discretionary uses. So as you'll see in a little bit when I get into section 6 of the bylaw, when you look at the list of permitted uses within a precinct, you're also there's some of those permitted uses are described as discretionary uses. So these uses would be permitted subject to certain criteria being met. And so where a community planning permit for discretionary use is required, the provisions from different sections of the bylaw will apply in terms of, the town identifying whether this is an appropriate condition or appropriate use for the area. So we look at sections like 2.12.6, which is conditions that might be tied to the approval of a discretionary use. 2.15, which talks about provisional approvals for CPP permits, but also 2.17. And this is a section that Paul talked about on criteria for considering variations. So the bylaw is telling us, okay, if we're going to provide a discretionary use here, let's see how really it is, appropriate within its context. Next slide, please. We've added a new section on vegetation removal and site alteration. Permits would be required for vegetation removal within 30 meters of a shoreline. And this is within the urban shoreline or the waterfront designations, as well as within woodlands that are greater than 0.5 hectares or vegetation or trees that are within or adjacent to the natural heritage system. Now, as Paul mentioned, there's exemptions to this. For example, forestry operations, licensed aggregate operations, and approved public works, as well as tree removal for heating purposes, for example, within the rural area. These are exempt from the requirements of the bylaw. But removal of vegetation also that's not identified as a tree, and we've added a definition for tree within the bylaw, would not constitute vegetation removal and trigger this process. You can add conditions to a community planning permit to minimize the extent of site grading and alteration. So, for example, requirements for stormwater management and restricting site alteration in steep slopes. And section 2.11 contains the various types of vegetation removals that are exempt from requiring a permit, if anyone wants to refer to that. Next slide, please. We've also added new provisions for secondary residential dwelling units within separate detached accessory buildings. So here's some of the provisions, such as, maximum gross floor area, maximum height, and minimum setbacks, and the intent really, and minimum separation distance from the main building on the property. And the intent of these provisions is really to ensure that if we are providing for secondary residential dwelling units within an accessory structure, that there's an appropriate amount of separation distance, but also amenity space for the principal building, but also the accessory building. Next slide, please. Section 5 of the bylaw might also look familiar. It's the parking and loading requirements. These are applying to all uses in all precincts within Huntsville. When it addresses matters such as minimum parking spaces, minimum loading spaces, dimensions of parking spaces, and things like that. And largely, we've carried these over from the existing bylaw, and we've updated provisions where required. Next slide, please. Now we're into section 6, which is the precinct and the overlay provisions. And this section contains all of the detail with respect to permitted uses, lot standards, and all that for the various precincts. So starting with the existing zones as a base, so the existing zones in your zoning bylaw, we simplified the number of zones to create fewer precincts. We went from 45 plus zones to approximately 20 precincts. So these precincts are in conformity really with the official plan land use designations. Next slide, please. And so on these next few slides, these are just examples of how we collapse those zones. You'll see 2 columns within the precinct on the left and the various zones that have been incorporated within each precinct on the right. So there was some overlap between some zones that would be incorporated into some precincts, and this is where we line things up with the OP designations. So for example, you'll see on this slide here, the C1 zone, which is showing up multiple times within the various residential precincts. Well, that's because we no longer have a C1, which is a convenience commercial zone, but really we're recognizing, in line with the town's official plan policy, that those uses are really, compatible in many cases within residential areas. And so we're permitting them in many cases as discretionary uses within the bylaw. So, just tying back, yes, those uses are permitted, but we need to make sure that we address certain matters to make sure that they're compatible. Next slide, please. And here you can see, for example, under mixed use precincts, you can see that we've reduced the number of mixed use zones, and they've all become one precinct. And this is because we found many similar provisions within the bylaw, the zoning bylaw, and within each of those zones that we thought, let's combine these, let's simplify things so that the intent is clear. Next slide, please. And again, moving on to urban business employment, community business employment, heavy employment. We wanted to keep those distinctions. We've combined the open space zones into one precinct. Next slide, please. We're still distinguishing between rural residential and rural, other rural precincts. We've also simplified the Hidden Valley zones into just recreational resort residential and resort commercial precincts. Next slide, please. And you can see here, we are carrying over what was currently the conservation zone into the conservation precinct. That still applies. And we've created a number of overlays, and the overlays are really meant to be almost a screening layer. So from the official plan, which identifies natural constraints and flood zone overlays, we carried those into the bylaw so that now if a property might be within a rural precinct, it might be within an urban shoreline precinct, there may be an overlay that applies, such as a natural constraints or a flood zone, where that'll indicate to the reviewer and ultimately the decision makers that, okay, there's other things to pay attention to. So if you're within a natural constraints overlay and there's a feature that might be identified, or you might be near something, you might have to submit documentation or maybe an environmental impact study to address how this proposed development on this property will impact that feature, or not impact or mitigate the impacts to that feature. Next slide, please. And so when you're looking at section 6 of the bylaw, you're really looking at each precinct, and you have permitted uses, permitted accessory uses, and lot requirements. And also, as you'll see on the next couple of slides, discretionary uses and the class 2 variation limits are also specified. So if you can go to the next slide. For example, here's a snapshot of the permitted use table within the residential precincts. So you can see on the right-hand side, those uses that are identified as discretionary. So financial establishment and food store. So these are uses that might have been permitted, as I mentioned, in a convenience commercial zone in your existing bylaw, that we're carrying over and saying, okay, these might be appropriate in some cases within neighborhoods. And so if it's discretionary use, it's permitted subject to certain criteria. So that means a review to make sure that it's compatible based on the criteria outlined in the bylaw. And provisional approval can be granted if there's certain conditions that the decision makers want to impose on that. Next slide, please. And then here's a snapshot of the accessory uses within the residential precincts. And so, this is just showing, accessory to one of those principal permitted uses. These are also permitted. This is very similar to what exists in your existing zoning bylaw. And then next slide, please. This is showing the lot requirements. So we're using regional commercial as an example here. And these are presented in a table format. So you can see here, minimum lot frontage, lot coverage, et cetera. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a minimum, or there's a class 2 variation limit listed. So this is what that means. So for example, if an application was proposing to increase the maximum lot coverage within the regional commercial precinct, so you can see lot coverage maximum is 40% there. What the class 2 variation limit means is that a variation of up to 20% from the bylaw requirement, so 20% increase from the 40%, would be considered a class 2 variation. So that means that's a staff approval variation. If you're over 20% of a variation, that becomes a class 3 variation requiring council approval. So you'll see these class 2 variation limits listed within these tables in the bylaw. Next slide, please. So this is showing a couple examples of the schedules that we prepared. You can see, looking closely, you can see that really the town has been divided into a grid. So it'll be easy to find, where the properties are. So these are going to be static maps that'll be available within the bylaw online. And there's also going to be, and it's already online as a draft, that interactive map where you can zoom in right on your property and see. So this is just kind of a new thing that we're adding because the maps will form part of the bylaw. Next slide, please. And so we've gone through all the different sections. Paul's taken us through the administration section and really the structure of the bylaw. And we just wanted to just cap it off with an example and a scenario of how the CPP bylaw would work. So using John as an example, who'd like to expand his commercial business here, you can see on the top half of this graphic, this is what John would have to go through under the current system. So with the existing zoning bylaw in place compared to what John would have to go through under the CPP bylaw on the lower half of the page. So at the top, you can see he has to go through a lengthy rezoning process of a minimum of 9 weeks, plus wait for an appeal period to go through before getting into the details of site plan application, and then ultimately over to his building permit. But at the bottom half of the page, what you do see is that what's now a zoning and site plan process get combined into a community planning permit process. And all of that is addressed within 45 days. And then moving on to the building permit process. So it's reducing those timelines. That's the goal, but also having more of an effective review to make sure that all of the matters that we should be looking at are addressed all at once rather than in separate processes. Next slide, please. So we just wanted to provide a quick overview of next steps. And now we're at the public meeting. So you can see that as the third circle or the second one from the left on the bottom. From here, we move on to revisions to the draft bylaw. And so we've already received many comments so far, including requests for the same provisions to apply for all waterfront precincts equally on Lake of Bays, and that the bylaw reflect the distinct character of the various lakes. We've also received some suggestions to list out specific study requirements to be identified at the pre-submission consultation, and that they should be identified as potential studies, which might open the door for others. So rather than listing everything, we want to make sure that if there's another potential study that might be required out there, we're not limited to just what's listed in the bylaw. And perhaps a way to do that is to move that list into an appendix. So just one of the suggestions. We've received various formatting suggestions, and yes, just to confirm, the final format will be much different than what you see here. This was really just to get the information out there and not spending time doing the formatting until the end, but it's going to be more of a visually appealing and easy to read document with photos similar to the new official plan. And there's questions about specific changes to provisions that we've received. So, for example, why did we, in some cases, change maximum lot coverage from 10% to 5% coverage? And we'll be looking at those in a little bit more detail. We've also heard a recommendation to add a section that describes the various precincts and what they are. So that might be up in our first section of the bylaw, so that the reader can understand the difference between, for example, a central business district and the urban mixed use and the community mixed use right up front, rather than having to go through the sections and trying to figure it out on their own. We received many comments on tree and vegetation removal. And many people say that it should not be addressed in the CPP bylaw, particularly in the rural area. But I hope everyone has seen that we're recognizing that there's many exemptions to tree removal, vegetation removal that are in the bylaw, particularly in the rural area, that do apply. And so we've also heard concerns about the natural constraints overlay, and that it may impact rural landowners who rely on firewood for heating purposes. And again, this is an exemption. If you rely on vegetation removal, tree removal for heating purposes, that's an exemption. We've heard that in the bylaw, again, speaking to formatting, we should bold or italicize defined terms, and absolutely, that's a great suggestion. We will definitely do that. And we've heard some site-specific comments about clarifications to, certain precinct provisions that apply to certain properties. So that's just kind of a flavor of comments that we've been receiving so far, and we'll be taking everything and including comments that we received today, and in the next couple of weeks, and going forward and making revisions to the draft bylaw based on this feedback. We'll be preparing a second draft, and that will be coming back to a second public meeting. So there's going to be more opportunity for comment. After that, we prepare the final bylaw for approval. So we'll be excited to see what more comments we receive, and happy to keep working on this. And takes me to my next slide, which is if there's any questions for us. And just wanted to thank you all for your time. I know this was a lengthy presentation combined between Paul and I, but it's a lot to cover, and we just want to be comprehensive for everyone. And I think those of you on planning committee have heard this before, but it's good to hear it again, I think, and happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks so much, David, for that presentation. And Paul, before we go to questions, I'll have to ask you guys to sit tight because we have a little bit more of a process to go through. And I will ask our manager planning, Richard, to present the report next.
Thank you, Your Worship. I don't think I have anything else to add at this point. The report kind of explains the exact same thing that David and Paul covered. So I think we can move on without having to go through that, if you agree.
Sure. You know what? You're in my script, so thanks for that. Okay. Following my script, at this time, I would ask if there are any members of the public who would like to ask questions and provide comments. So the public's before council. So I will ask our deputy clerk to now jump in, please.
Thank you, Mayor Terziano. Members of the public are informed to use the raise hand button or press *9 if you are connected by telephone to indicate now that you would like to address committee. And Mayor Terziano, I see one hand raised so far. So I will bring that individual into the meeting. A reminder, when you're being added to the meeting as a panelist, your video will be momentarily interrupted. When you've been added to the meeting, your video will appear in the committee member panel. Please ensure that you have your microphone and video, if possible, turned on, and confirm your full name before beginning your comments. Also a reminder that presentations are limited to 10 minutes. Thank you. Mayor Terziano, the individual has taken their hand down, so I see no hands raised at this time.
Okay. Will we give the public just another minute or two, because I fear that when I go on to the next step, that will be it.
I do. Oh, there's one more up. I'll bring the person in.
Okay.
Mute. Okay.
No.
Okay, you start. Okay. Not there. No.
There you are. Okay, I can see somebody, although you're a little bit blurry. Looks like Mary Jane Smith.
It is. Hello, Karen.
Okay, do you
Sorry,
want
we're-
to do your
I'm
name
Mary-
and address
yep.
for the record?
Mary Jane Smith, 1778 Etwell Road, Huntsville, Ontario, P1H 2J2. So I've got 3 questions here. Just to let everyone know, we have other families here because of rural internet service. We're all trying to do it at our house. And they will be asking questions as well. So hopefully that works out. Because not everybody gets good internet in rural Huntsville.
We will do whatever we can to make sure everybody has a shot here.
Okay. Okay. So first question was a question about the survey. Can we find out how many participants responded to that survey?
Richard or our consultants, does anybody have that answer offhand? Daniel?
Hi, this is Daniel here from Dillon Consulting. Yeah, we had about 50 respondents to the survey that was online.
Okay, that's a pretty poor response. I can say that all the families that are sitting right here now knew nothing about this bylaw and knew nothing about the survey. So we don't think your community engagement strategy worked very well. Second question. So the how to read step 1 refers to a schedule A1-17. I couldn't find it. I don't know where that is to be found.
That's on, where are you referencing that from, Mary Jane?
That's on the draft bylaw. It tells you how to read.
How to read?
We're telling you how to read the draft bylaw. Step 1 says refer to schedule A1-17. And I could not find that.
Richard, can you help with that?
Sure I can. I think that is that needs to be fixed. That was a reference to a previous I guess version of the bylaw, and the schedules will have to be renumbered. So that would be a formatting thing that we'll fix in the second draft. And hopefully that'll be a little clearer in the second draft.
Okay. And my next question is, so if I own property greater than 0.5 hectares, but are located in the natural constraints precincts on the mapping, do I have to get a permit to cut firewood for personal use for heating and cooking?
Richard?
Sure, thank you. Through you, Your Worship. So the exemptions are king. So this bylaw, it applies to the entire town, and it triggers these permit requirements. But if the activity that you're thinking of doing is one that's listed as exempt, then there's no permit requirements. So what we hope people will look at is section 211 of the bylaw, which lists those exemptions. And if you find something like personal heating, removal of trees for personal heating, it is listed there. But if there are other exemptions that you think would be appropriate given the rural context, then we can work those in also. So that's what I would say to that, is that activity is already exempt. And I think we can do a lot to try and clarify how important the exemption is. And one thing we think we can do is in the how to read section is really clarify that exemptions are exemptions and they're king. And if something is listed as an exemption, then you can stop reading there. So we'll do our best to clarify that in the revised draft also.
Just on that, I know in those exemptions, I don't have that one right on there, but there is one that it says you have to be outside of the natural constraint zones. And if you refer to your precinct mapping, the majority of Huntsville is in the natural constraint zones. So to me, your exemptions are overruled by almost every other section in this bylaw.
Richard, do you have, or Paul, something you can add there, please?
Yes, through you, Madam Mayor, we've heard this comment before, and we are clarifying that. We do understand that it's a little confusing, but as Richard had indicated, the exemptions rule, and we will clarify that.
Thanks for that.
Okay, so we have another family person here that wants to ask questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mary Jane. I'll just ask whoever's up next to state your name and address for the record, if you don't mind.
Hi, oh, I better stand. Hi, my name is Carolyn Long. Me and my husband Bill are here, and we own and operate a maple syrup farm. It's a legacy maple. We're on Ravenscliff Road. We have 90 acres. It has been an operational maple syrup farm since almost 15 years. We purchased it almost 5 years ago, and have improved it and invested a lot of money to make this a viable operation. Now, there are several things within this bylaw that are going to make it extremely difficult for us, and it is very concerning, as most of our land is under a natural constraint, which we did not even know about until just prior to the last meeting. And just for clarification, we tried to get involved in the last meeting, but we were for some reason unable to hook up with the Zoom. And that's the first time we've had problems with Zoom in the last year and a half. So what I want to talk about, I'll specifically address the exemptions. And this is what one of the major concerns are, is there's a little bit of a rabbit hole that you go through when you're going through the bylaw. When you're looking at 2.11.1, it indicates there are no restrictions on cutting wood for personal use. If you look at 4.19.1, it restricts the processing of firewood for personal use if your land has a natural constraint on it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's in 4.19.1. Now then, if I look at 2.23, there's a statement that is really quite concerning, which states that if there is a conflict in the different areas of the bylaw, and you cannot apply both at the same time, the most restrictive provision must be complied with, and must is not an option under definition. So this is only dealing with our taking wood for our own use in our home. It does not address firing up our evaporator in order to process maple syrup. In fact, maple syrup is only mentioned once under definitions of farm. I have no idea how this applies to us outside of what has been added here, talking about natural constraints. Everything that is a natural constraint that has to do with wood or vegetation affects us. And I don't see anything here that allows us to do what we need to do. I feel it's very restrictive, and I feel like our land has essentially been taken away. So how do we address that?
Okay, thanks for that question. I'm going to either turn it over to Paul or Richard, just whoever. Paul, do you want to address that, please?
Richard put his finger up first, so he can address, and then I'll jump in.
All right.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for the question. So through you, Your Worship, I think that's a great point. I think sometimes when we write these things, we mean to be thinking about these rural uses, and our intent is to ensure that we're not over-regulating in those areas or changing the rules too much in those areas. And I think what we hear today and what we'll hear from all these comments are things that we can tweak to make this a bylaw that everyone's going to be happy with. And when I hear what was just said, it makes me think that our definition of forestry operations can easily be expanded to include maple sugar production, and I think it would address the concern that you're hearing, because forestry operations are also one of the activities that would be exempt from requiring a permit. So I think that that's a great comment, and we can definitely address it.
Could we also include other artisans, like people who make furniture? And there's a lot of other small operators that do some really magnificent things in Muskoka. And if they are in a natural constraint, which a lot of Huntsville is, that puts their livelihood at risk as well.
Yep, and I think we're looking at our definition of forestry operations to expand it, and to look at things like trails for skidders, if you are doing harvesting. So yeah, we're gonna incorporate a newer definition, and you can tell us if it's expanded to your liking, but we hear you, and I think those are great comments.
It would be useful. I'm assuming there's going to be a live meeting, a face-to-face meeting, and there's going to be another meeting before this is settled. Am I correct?
We are definitely having another public meeting, and we are going to do everything within our power to make it an in-person meeting.
Okay, good.
We don't,
because we need to make sure.
Yeah. We will find a way to make it an in-person meeting. I think that message has come through loud and clear, and we'll figure out a way to do it.
I think that would mitigate a lot of issues with other rural people that have other issues other than what we have, but may again revolve around vegetation and around trees.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. And we appreciate those.
Anticipation of the numbers that they're getting in response to these public meetings is not getting out to the public.
Oh, okay. I just had a little relayed message from Smith. And he just wanted to articulate that he feels, and we all feel here in this room, that the message getting out to rural people, which is about 33% of Huntsville is rural, that the message is not getting out about these meetings or some of the different aspects that you talked about earlier.
Like 50 respondents.
Yeah, 50 respondents to a survey is pretty small for a town our size, I'm assuming. That does seem like a small number.
And how many people on the Zoom meetings?
Like what can be done to get more engagement from rural participants so that people know? Because all of us in this room are latecomers. We didn't know this was happening.
And ask them about the response on the Zoom.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. I'm trying to listen to him at the same time.
Oh, he doesn't want to be in front of the camera.
I'm just asking.
He's trying to figure out how many people are in the waiting room.
Or response
You have
to
to
the
stand
Zoom.
over here.
No,
Yeah.
1778 Atwell Road.
P1H 2J2.
And pardon?
P1H 2J2.
P1H 2J2.
I didn't even do that.
I'm just wondering why we're having such a poor response to these Zoom meetings. Like it's either the fact that we don't have the resources to get involved in these meetings, or we haven't had the sufficient notification. Why wasn't something put in our tax bill? You managed to get that to me.
Okay.
Just saying.
Yeah, we hear you. Believe me, we do lots of public engagement, and the numbers are not always high. It's not just this particular issue. You can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink, so to speak. So, we can put the public engagement out there. We can't make people engage. If
Yeah,
you're
but
not, if you're not hearing about it, then you know what? We need to take that under advisement and figure out a way to make sure that we somehow beef it up, especially you're citing the rural area as not hearing. So
Yeah.
we'll figure out what we can do. We'll
Yeah.
try to get the word out.
Like I say, I get a tax bill every year. Feel free to put something in there.
Okay,
But when you want to change my life, it'd be nice to know.
fair
Thank
enough.
Can I say one word? Yeah, hang on.
Bring
I
on.
got another one.
Okay. Gotta love rural internet, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I'll be quick. It's Bill Spring from 2012 Etwell Road, P1H 2J2, just down the road from the Smiths. I just like to say that, you know, as a retiree on 200 acres, a lot of my life is tied up with removing vegetation just to keep my property, you know, intact and to keep the buildings safe from trees falling on them and to keep my trails open and making maple syrup and firewood for heating and that. And to add, to even think about getting a permit to do any of that stuff just takes away from the time I need to be spending on removing that vegetation. Just our properties are dependent on removing vegetation constantly. That's what it's like out here. Okay, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Bill. And we're hearing everything you say, and that's part of the process. So we can hear where this bylaw isn't getting it right and we can make changes. So
Oh, one more?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have another one.
Hi there. This is Roger Earl, Lot 5, Concession 11, Chafee, P1H 2K5. This is a little bit much for me to take in, but one of the things I noticed is with your exemptions is there's no real, doesn't seem to be a stipulation on volumes. Like you say, well, you can take vegetation for home use. Well, what is that? I mean, some people burn a little bit of wood. Some people burn a lot. Will that cause a problem in the future?
Richard?
Well, good question. So through you, your worship, I don't have an answer. I think we left it kind of a blanket if it is for home heating. If there's a number, if there's a volume that you think is appropriate, then you can feel free to share that. But I think the way we left it is unspecified. So yeah, I guess I think it was better to leave it unspecified, but we can specify a certain number of trees for home heating purposes. I know some tree removal bylaws do that, but we were trying not to specify that.
It's being left open then.
So as not to restrict that activity.
Oh, okay. So there is no restriction then.
Except if you're
Right.
straight.
Thank you.
We have someone else.
Okay.
Hello. Bill Long here, 2795 Ravenscliff Road, P1H 2J2. And my question is, if you are a woodcutter and you're doing it commercially and you're doing it on your own land, are there any restrictions for that if you're just cutting firewood? Firewood for resale.
Who's going to
And
take
if
that?
you are in, and if you are in a natural constraint area.
So that's good question. Another good question. All things that we should consider in our expanded definition of forestry operations and what type of activities get included in that. And so we will consider that also. And I guess yeah, so I think we can think about tree removal for firewood and whether that needs to be limited or whether that's also an exemption. So we will think about that.
Okay, thank you.
Your turn. Okay.
Is that it, gang? All right, I will say thank you to, yeah.
No, we're not done.
Okay.
I'd like to follow up on one of my questions.
Okay.
So I'm reading 2.11, community planning permit exemptions. Number 5 says site alteration or vegetation removal in the rural side of a natural or area. So that means I can't do it because I'm not outside of it. And that is under your exemptions column. So
where did they go? I think we just lost our group delegation there.
I
Did we
do
lose
believe
them?
I do
Okay.
believe that we've lost them off of the call. I will watch for them to show back up in the attendees list though, however.
Okay. Can
Would you like?
Do you want to see if there's any other raised hands, Crystal? Thanks.
Absolutely. So once again, members of the public are reminded to use the raise hand button. And if you're connected by telephone, please press *9 to indicate that you would like to address committee. And Mayor Terziano, I'm seeing one individual with their hand raised.
Okay.
A reminder to please ensure you have your microphone and video if possible turned on and confirm your full name before beginning your comments.
I feel like we just lost that one as well, Crystal.
I believe we did. I do have one individual who has raised their hand who are connected by telephone, so I'm going to unmute them now at this time.
Okay.
You are now unmuted. Feel free to provide comment or ask your questions.
Hello?
Hello? Can you state your name for us?
Yes, it's Maxine Vestido. I live at 872 Williamsport Road, and that's in Chaffey, P1H2J4.
Okay, go ahead, Maxine.
Yeah, I'm particularly concerned. There are a number of concerns I have with this bylaw. One of particular concern for me is I live in a rural area. When we moved here back in '85, it was RU1. At some point, it got changed to RU2. On this draft, it's showing this area as backlot waterfront. That's a huge change, and it isn't fitting for the area for so many reasons, historically, culturally, naturally. And then when I look further, several parcels along the corridor of the Big East River are proposed to be rezoned in that fashion. As you're aware, I'm sure, the permitted uses and many other aspects change considerably. I'm also concerned when I see some of your mapping, like the interactive map, it does have some natural constraint hatching in some areas, including where I live. On the precinct map, it does not. But even that isn't sufficient because the interactive tool, which is showing the hatching for the natural constraints, isn't showing, it's for the deer wintering, but if you look at the mapping in this area, there's also like a deer yard stratum, and there also should be like the Big East River Park, the natural area. There should also be the heritage areas. And when you look at the town of Huntsville's official plan, Schedule C, some of those are showing, and they should be carried over to this draft CPP bylaw. As well as that, similarly, with the Muskoka official plan. And again, you look at the schedules. I don't know if I have the actual one in front of me. But if you look at the schedules, it also is showing in the mapping that like there are a number of constraints, such as I've mentioned, that are there in the Muskoka official plan that are not. And so when you look at this area, it is rural. It has been rural. It should be rural for so many reasons. And then there should be the additional layers and several additional layers because of the natural heritage areas, because of the two natural constraints that I mentioned. And also there's the archaeological, which is high all along the shores of the Big East River. And there's also steep slopes. Like there's just a number of constraints. And then given the history, given the uses, given the size of lots, all those kinds of things, and there's many more, all fit into the rural. I do not understand why these parts are being changed to backfront waterfront. There's waterfront, yes, but since we've been here, prior to when we've been here, looking back in the assessment notices, like back to 72, back to like the old house that was here, is like 1904. These area, it has a long history of rural. And other aspects, as you know, like the Beaver Dam and the stream isn't marked on the map, and it connects the pond, the Beaver Dam, to the river. All those aspects are important parts. And if you read these documents, which I've been trying to do, the continuous corridor is important and is to be conserved, protected, preserved, restored, all those sorts of things in all of these documents. And yet this is being presented in this kind of a way, which is quite contrary. And I really think that in a serious way, needs to be looked at again and redressed. And again, I've mentioned before, and I sent some information today, I was rushed, so it wasn't in a form that I liked, but photos of species at risk in the area, have been in the area, continue to be in the area. And I know that in this plan, they're also talking about, well, this and this and this option in terms of how this might go forward. And, is everywhere, or it's first the waterfront designations. Well, first of all, it shouldn't be happening. And then secondly, it should certainly not be first happening. And then with some of the changes that have been made through the years, there have been some seasonal residential lots. They're now being changed to like shoreline residential or waterfront residential, I think, where even the residential lots are rural residential. Like the whole area is rural, and it's a sudden jolt to be changing it to backlot waterfront. And when you say backlot waterfront, it's backlot waterfront from where? Where's the backlot? Like it's from the river, or is it leaving that zone in between the flood fringe to be developed like it is in other aspects, which it shouldn't be because of the sensitivity to these sensitive nature of this area, the soil, the filtration, erosion, all those kind of factors. I mean, it really needs to be looked at.
Okay.
It really needs to be looked at. It really needs to be looked at in a big way. This is not a small change; it's a huge change. And I guess what I'm also trying to see is how many. Like when I look at the mapping, and then I tried to look at an overview, not just like from Algonquin, down to Vernon, but I also tried to look at some of the different precincts. And I'm curious how many properties are being rezoned with this proposed community planning permit bylaw.
Okay,
because
Maxine, I'm going to try to get, I think one of your questions seems to be that you believe that you've been rezoned from rural to backlot waterfront as part of this community planning permit. I'm going to ask Richard to weigh in here. I do not believe we've changed any zonings as part of this process, but Richard, can you maybe confirm that, please?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Your Worship. So I think what we're hearing here is a landowner whose property was zoned rural 2. So we used to have two rural, well, three rurals. So we had rural 1, rural 2, and rural residential. And the rural 2 zone was something that existed for I guess, since the 2006 official plan and in the 2008 zoning bylaw. And it was a rural zoning category to deal with back lots. So what we've done is just we've changed the name to waterfront backlot because we have policies in our official plan that deal with waterfront backlots. But the actual lot requirements and shouldn't have changed. And if they have, then if there's specifics that can be pointed out, then we can look at those. But there shouldn't be a big difference between the waterfront backlot versus the rural 2, which was a backlot rural zone. So they're very similar.
Actually, I would say otherwise. And I would say if the change is happening, it should be back to RU1, because that is more fitting for what has gone on and is going on in this area, generally speaking. And when I say, if you look at the mapping and you see, it is not just particular to my lot or my property, it's the exception that isn't. And what it seems to be is there are those properties just back and all around that continue to be RU1 or, rural. And throughout, it seems like you hear people talk about strip cutting when it comes to trees, and that it seems to be like a strip of development proposed or development area because it's saying that the waterfront will be dealt with first, kind of thing. That it's coming up for change to backlot waterfront.
Okay, Maxine.
And then, as I say, the strip between the backlot waterfront and the river, what's the intended use there? How is that zoned? In other areas, a few areas which was opposed, there were like the lots developed, and that is not suitable for the shoreline for lots of reasons, and especially, like I've already mentioned, the heritage areas, the Big East River Park, all kinds of things like that. And then further, I want to make another point, and I know I've gone on about this, but I do feel strongly, and there are a number of factors here, is when I look at the mapping, and I don't hold the town responsible for this, I suspect it has to do with the MNR. There's the floodway, the flood fringe as zones. And there's a hard line from one to the other. And the hard line is, I understand from the bits I've seen, is that that's where the mapping stopped. It's not where the river stops, it's not where the floodway stops. It's just they didn't do any further mapping. They didn't get further. Well, they ran out of money or time or what. But the river continues, the floodway continues, and the flood fringe has very different permitted uses than the floodway. And I'm saying changes like these with the ramifications of them, I feel are premature until you have completed mapping for an area like this. And I know I've gone on, but there are a number of points, and I will leave it at that for tonight. But I really don't want to, people have been saying up and coming to these meetings, like, wake up, rural people. And it's really true. There's a lot of rural land, like it's our character that's being threatened. It's the long term that's being threatened.
Okay, Maxine, we appreciate those comments. And as I mentioned earlier, I hope you were on the call. We are going to try to definitely have an in-person meeting next time around. But, we are happy to explore everything that you've mentioned tonight and make sure that we address any concerns that you've raised.
And on the in-person meeting, I did notice, because as I say, I have been looking at, and I think in the official plans, it suggests looking at the like the areas around. So I have been looking at Muskoka Lakes, and I have been looking at Lake of Bays, and I feel they have both of them have environmentally more favorable plans than what Huntsville is proposing. But on the specific point about the in-person, I think it was Lake of Bays that I noticed in particular, they have had in-person. I think they had in-person maybe 2 places, maybe Dwight and Baysville or something like that. So I'm just passing that along as far as a consideration as well, like maybe Huntsville or maybe Port Sydney, or even if the weather was nice, it could have been in Mill Park, I don't know. But I think in-person would be helpful.
Yeah. We're definitely going to try to give it a shot.
And I also think having some of these maps posted would be helpful. And I've asked, and I said the other thing, my last point, this one really will be, I stopped in like a day or so ago because what I was wanting to see was a map of the whole area with the current zoning in place, like the town of Huntsville mapping in place. And I want to see, like, beside it, to compare how that compares with the planning permit, community planning permit bylaw mapping as a whole. And then I can see, oh no, it's just this spot, or no, it is widespread and this is substantial, or it's not. Do you know what I mean? And but to go through 143 or however many maps to get a feel for it or the pattern, and it has been rather circuitous at times in terms of somebody else who mentioned getting to some of the information. So I'm saying some mapping that gives an overview would be very helpful, and if it could be posted a few places where it's easily accessible, whether it's a community center, the town hall, and other suggestions. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Maxine.
Thanks, Karen. I mean, there.
Okay, Crystal, any other hands?
Yes, we do have one individual to bring in, so I will bring them in at this time.
Okay.
A reminder to please ensure that you have your microphone and video, if possible, turned on, and confirm your full name before beginning your comments.
Okay. If you're just going.
It's good. Hello.
Okay, there you are.
Yes, Your Worship, Karen. My name is Karen. It's a good name, as long as it's no hashtag in front of it, okay? And the council members, it's a pleasure to finally get through here. My goodness, I can understand why people are frustrated, but to keep things very short, I have one major question that sort of was touched on by the previous caller. I'd love to connect with her. You know, consultation is very, very, very important when it comes to residents in the rural area. And I just wanted to make note that it's rather disturbing that Port Sydney Hall and Utterson Hall and maybe Allensville, well, there is no more Allensville Hall, sorry, Aspiden Hall, are requiring double vaccinations. Meanwhile, Ford is asking, making a plan that everything is going to be removed. Anyway, you can think about that one for this kind of scenario of consultation. My question is, in regards to the mapping and in regards to subdivision rules and regulations, the mapping that's been noted as being kind of off the wall when it comes to the zoning as to actual reality of what is actually there, we notice in one specific subdivision that seems to be development that is not currently there, and yet it's reflected in the map. So is what is that about? Because it actually appears like there's trespassing going on. Who made the map? And there was a submission that was made. I don't know whether that's being addressed tonight. All those submissions that were written, so my question is, the maps are reflecting a reality that doesn't exist as far as land divisions are concerned. And in specific cases, we're talking in the township of Stevenson in a subdivision, which is called Clark's Lane. And there's a road that's going out of Clark's Lane that is not there. it doesn't exist. And my goodness, so could somebody address that? I would think that the planning chair, perhaps maybe the deputy mayor, might be able to address that.
I think we'll keep these questions to our planners and consultants, and I'm not sure whether Richard understands your question, because I'm certainly don't myself, but Richard?
Yes, thank you. Through you, Your Worship. So just to clarify that we did receive comments, and those will be considered as we review and revise the bylaw. And then I think the question about mapping, I think, I'm not sure if David's around and available, but perhaps he could chime in just to explain the origins of the mapping and how they were built from a combination of the zoning and the OP layers.
Yes. Thank you, Richard. Through your worship to Karen. The mapping was based on the town's existing zoning layer, and similar to those tables that we reviewed in the presentation, a lot of the zones were collapsed and put into certain precincts. So we didn't create new lots or roads or anything there. If it may be that there's in this situation, maybe a registered plan of subdivision, although it may not be developed yet, it may be a legal lots of record that you may be looking at. But I'd be curious to know exactly the location that you're looking at, because certainly it was something we'd like to confirm. But the difference between the zoning and the precinct mapping, so the existing zoning mapping and the existing zoning bylaw and the precincts in this draft CPP bylaw, in terms of properties, it's exactly the same in terms of lots. It's just the color of them changed based on the precinct that it's in versus the zone. But if you have a specific comment about a specific property, and maybe you've submitted this comment already, but we certainly would like to know, and we can certainly look into that.
Well,
thanks, David. I think Director Maxwell has something to add as well.
Thank you, Your Worship, and good evening, Karen. I was going to mention, I believe it's remnants from an old subdivision plan where the draft road has been on our mapping for probably 20 years, although the subdivision that is in question has been amended and is under appeal right now with the OLT. The old original road fabric still shows up as being a probable road that was going to go in, but that will have changed with this new application that's currently being reviewed with the OLT. So we'll definitely update the mapping to reflect that that road doesn't exist. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, because that is actually trespassing on land. There was a submission that was made, which you probably maybe have previewed, where there would be trespass issues, and where if those things need to be dealt with, and the mapping, I'm hoping that you will be able to correct that with your consultants to reflect the actuality and the fact that there is nothing beyond the subdivision, which is a regulated private subdivision, and all of the rules of a subdivision in the province apply to this subdivision. So that would be really appreciated.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks. We will get those maps updated. Thank you so much. Anything further?
No, I think that's it. I think that's a good show on Kirsten's part in recognizing that. And thank you very much, Your Worship, for addressing the questions that I had.
Great. Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too.
Crystal, is there any other hands up tonight?
Members of the public are reminded to use the raise hand button or press *9 if you're connected by telephone to indicate that you would like to address committee.
You want to? No.
You've done.
And at this time, I'm seeing no hands raised.
Okay, thank you for that. I do believe, hang on, let me see my script here. I think we can turn to council now. Questions? Councillor Thompson, your hand was up first a long time ago.
I was jumping the gun, Your Worship, but thank you. And through you to either Richard or our guests here tonight, David or Paul, with regards to the vegetation and tree management section of the proposed bylaw, the draft bylaw, where you're talking about 0.5 hectares, which is, I guess, a little more than an acre. But is that intended to address the clear cutting situation that seems to be plaguing our community in recent years?
Richard?
Sure, great question. Through you, Your Worship. Yes, so the issue is we do have natural constraints mapped in Schedule C of our official plan, but so we know about those because they're mapped, but there are other natural areas in the town that aren't mapped as being natural constraints, but that's just simply because they haven't been studied yet. They could be natural constraints. They could meet the definition of a wetland. They could meet the definition of significant wildlife habitat. So putting in a number like 0.5 hectares means that we're looking at those features, those woodlands that are over 0.5 hectares, and if there is a potential that it could be a significant natural feature area, then we would ask for studies to be done before permits being issued for their removal. And it also helps to regulate if a woodland was removed and they didn't talk to us, then having that value, that number, is just a trigger for us to know which ones that we're really worried about. We're not really worried about just individual tree removal. It's more about woodland removal and wanting to control kind of preemptive removal of those prior to going through an acceptable approval process.
Councillor Stone.
Thank you. 2 points I'd like to make. The first one is much like Councillor Thompson's. I'm hearing from several people who are really concerned about the tree cutting, and it comes to my mind that we're really not worried about people sustainably, cutting their forests. What we're worried about is clear cutting, or clearing a whole area. Is there not a possibility to change it to look at it in that sense, where you're allowed a certain percentage of clearing of your property without telling these people they want to cut 20 trees down on their 100 acres and they're supposed to come and get a permit, which is not reasonable. I'm just going to leave it at that about trying to get a percentage for clear cutting or clearing of land, as opposed to, having to get a permit to cut trees. My other point is simply about the shortened timeline. I love it for the builders. It's fantastic. And it's going to speed everything up. But my great worry is notification to the neighbors, because they go on holiday, they come back and, oh my God, sorry, you missed the time. You really don't have any input anymore, and it's already started to be built. So I don't know how to mesh those two unless notification goes out much earlier than is deemed necessary by the Planning Act. But it is a concern of mine. And I would like the notification area to be much larger, actually, when there's a variance.
Thanks, Counselor. Is there any comments from Richard or the consultants on that notification piece?
Well, perhaps I'd call on David to give a bit of feedback on that.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, through your worship to Councillor Stone. That's a great comment. And one of the things, of course, that we wanted to include in this bylaw, because of course, notification is not one of the legislative requirements for including within a CPP bylaw. So we did want to make sure that we provided that opportunity. And one of the things that we did was to play with that, to ensure that, okay, yes, we need to maintain that 45-day time frame, but to make sure that people had all of the information they needed to comment before that clock starts ticking. And that's tied to the whole complete application process and identifying that, yes, you've submitted everything. We've received comments from agencies. Now your application is complete. Now the timeline starts. That's when the notice goes out, so that when people are reviewing, they do have all of the information that will be, or that would be publicly available right from the beginning. So we have thought about it that way, but I certainly hear your comments on, of course, it is an overall shortened time frame. So we'll definitely take that back and look at it, as well as you made a comment about the notification area. So we can take that back and discuss that as well.
Thanks for that. Deputy Mayor Alcock.
Thank you, Your Worship. I think I can kind of pick up on the last comment. At least my question is related to that. One thing about listening to the comments tonight, which I thought were really, really good and really helpful, is I worry a little bit that like any regulation that you bring in, we may not actually get everything that we should have in there. So there could in fact be certain gaps, you know, as was apparent tonight. And that's the importance of public participation, which was also highlighted to us tonight. And so here is my question, and that is, I think I expressed this before, and it may have been explained to me, and I apologize if it was and I've forgotten. But when I go way back in the presentation, first presentation, section 2, and it was talking about the application process, class 1, class 2, class 3. Class 1, straightforward, staff look at it, nothing, easy peasy, all good. And then class 2, class 3, and this speaks to Councillor Stone's question about notification. I had similar concerns, but my question is, so you respond, you submit your issues with respect to whatever might be happening with that application, but I don't see any public process there. It's like we've sort of thrown the baby out with the bathwater, as it were, you know, in the sense that I know we want to speed it up, and I think that makes sense. I know we want to be more simpler in many respects by collapsing our regulations. But I don't see where the public, where they currently have the opportunity to come to planning committee or committee of adjustment or, you know, or council finally, I don't see that point. And then without that, when it goes to appeal, the only person that's allowed to appeal is the applicant. So it's like a double miss for the public. And please correct me if I'm wrong and I've misinterpreted, but it worries me. And it worries me when I, again, go back to hearing a lot of the comments that we heard tonight. We clearly, and this is no, you know, reflection of the good work that's been done on this, but I think it's almost a Herculean effort to try and cover all of the various things that might be covered in something like this. So what if we don't? What if we miss something? And how does a member of the public speak to that? So that's my question.
Richard, David, who wants this one?
Well, I think I will throw it to David because I know he'll be able to answer it much more eloquently than I. But I guess if it helps, David or Paul, I can show the slide for step 3 that I think Councillor Alcock is referring to.
As through your worship to Councillor Alcock, that would be great, Richard, if you could throw that out. So first, if we miss, while Richard's pulling that up, if we miss something in the bylaw, I mean, that's we're trying not to, but you're right, it's a big change. We want to make sure that we capture everything. But one of the things that we're trying to do to address that is have more of these types of meetings. So make sure that we do capture everything. But certainly if we do miss something, then it's something that can be further addressed either through a housekeeping amendment to a bylaw, through kind of the monitoring and implementation of the bylaw once it goes. It's like any official plan bylaw that gets passed, particularly a new one. It's important to monitor it, and if something's not working, then certainly it can be further amended. And then to the point on the consultation. So you're right in your understanding in that class 1, it's easy staff approval. Class 2 and class 3 where there's variations. So class 2, where there's a staff variation, if there are lots of issues that are raised by either members of the public or staff or members of council with respect to an application, and it's class 2 and it's going towards staff approval, there's an option either by staff or by council to bump it up to a class 3. So if there's a lot of public interest, for example, and you think that would warrant a public meeting in front of planning committee, then you bump it up to class 3. And there is class 3 is that process where you have that planning committee meeting where people would be able to come and speak in front of committee, and the decision could be made after that, but after considering all of those comments. So that's kind of how we built in that check within that process. And if it's something where there's not lots of issues coming up, or it's pretty straightforward as a class 2, then that's what should be dealt with as through staff approval. And that's kind of why we wanted to provide that option for class 2 to class 3. So hopefully that provides some clarification there.
Deputy Mayor Alcock, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Just a quick comment back or question. That's reassuring that a councillor can do that. But the implication being that it has to be a fairly contentious issue. And as every person around the table knows as well as you guys for sure, sometimes you don't know something is contentious. It might be one neighbor that raises an issue and it's a really significant issue, but it might be one person who has identified it. So I guess I don't have an answer. I confess it makes me a little uncomfortable, because all of a sudden it kind of politicizes it again, because you're pushing then the councillors to be responsible, and which we should be anyway, I get it, but to make that decision, all right, this should be bumped up to committee or council. So I appreciate your response. I appreciate it's difficult, but it is something I think, from my perspective, I would love a little more thought on that public participation component.
Okay. My apologies if I've mixed up who was next, but I think Councillor Armour. You're still muted, Councillor.
There's too much noise behind me, so that's good. Anyhow, I'll be quick. I just need to know the difference between existing cutting of vegetation and I purchase 100 acres new and want to build a home and put in maple syrup. Is there a process for that, planning that I have to go through, or is just get a permit to build my home and cut my trees down? And the second part, if you don't meet the 45-day commitment that we're talking about by shortening it from 9 to 45 days, what's the process after that?
Richard?
Yes, thank you. Good question. So through you, Your Worship. So I think the first part of the question was dealing with the existing rules. So I'm assuming you're talking about like a rural property, 100 acres, and if you bought it to build your dream home. And so in the rural area, so there's, well, throughout the town, there's no tree removal bylaw in place. And currently, site plan control is only, it's town-wide, but it focuses on the waterfront for single-family homes, and it focuses more on major development outside the waterfront area. So in terms of planning approvals out there, in the rural area, it would only be if you were varying from the rules that are in place that you might need a planning approval, whether it's a minor variance or a zoning bylaw amendment. If you aren't varying from those rules and you're building something as of right, we call it, then you just would go straight to a building permit, and they would look at the building itself, and also the septic and that kind of thing. But so right now it's that's the rules in the rural area. And I guess major takeaway for the rural area is we want to exempt the tree removal activities that are listed already, so that we wouldn't be interfering with those types of activities. So I think you heard earlier about the sugar bush. So I think we want to think more about that and think about incorporating that, so we're not impacting the ability to do that. And then for single family homes in the rural area, I think we want to exempt those also. So really it wouldn't change much for you out in the rural area is our goal. And then I think, I'm not sure I remember the next part of your question, but if David or Paul
said we were shortening the time frame to 45 days, basically from 90. So I just wonder if we don't meet the 45 days, we don't get into the council, for example, within the 45 days.
Right. So so basically the rule of 45 days is kind of if a decision is not made within 45 days, then the applicant would have the ability to appeal for lack of decision. So when we talk, and maybe Paul or David could fill us in, but when we talk to other municipalities that are using the community planning permit system, what we find is those appeals for lack of decision are rarely happening, because usually people are pre-consulting, they know the rules based on what they've heard at that stage, and they have a comfort level based on where they are in the process and working through it. So appeals could happen if you don't meet the 45 days, but I guess what we've been hearing is it's rare. And I don't know, Paul, if you had anything else to add on that.
Through you, Madam Mayor, I would agree with Richard. It's 45 days. If you miss it by a little bit, it might be 15 days you miss it by. Somebody wants to appeal to OLT to move it along, and they're going to be waiting 6 to 8 months to get a hearing. So there's no shortness by appealing for lack of decision. So I think it's going to be fairly rare.
Just quickly further that while you're there, Paul, is the 45 days hard in our plan, or could we say we want that section to say 60 days?
It's Madam Mayor, it's a Planning Act requirement for the 45. That's set by the Planning Act. But we've revised it. When I went through that time frame, we've set it that once you get the comments from the agencies, that's when the clock starts ticking. And that's what a lot of the other municipalities have been doing to give them sufficient time to be able to get it to council. Is once you get all the comments in, then the clock starts ticking.
Thanks. Councillor Schumacher.
Through you, Your Worship, thank you. And Richard, glad to hear that you guys are going to maybe retweak the forestry definition and look at the different uses for rural areas. I, of course, do not want to see any clear cutting, but again, when we talk about percentages also too, keeping in mind that those people that are doing firewood for commercial use, I mean, most of them have a good plan. They, you know, repopulate their growth so that it's good and feasible. And I do know some seniors in our area that maybe used to cut personally for themselves and now go out and source locally for firewood because they are more in that seniors category and can't do their own personal cutting. So they do rely on local cutters to create that business for them. So keeping those things in mind, the sugar bush, appreciated. I know that Karen Inslee had spoke about that road on Clark's Lane, and I can confirm that in 1984 it was cleared out in order to create a road, and it took 37 years now for that to grow back in. So I guess that is my question, is that if somebody comes forward with a proposal, they clear out space for a road, and then their development falls apart. Are we putting any provisions in place to say, how do we fix that?
Yes, so through you, Your Worship, that's a great question. And I guess the objective is to ensure that there would be no clearing of the road until the approval is received, or the provisional approval is received. So that's the goal there. And then we wouldn't have to worry about that. That's the goal.
Councillor Wiebe.
Thank you, Your Worship. A couple of points, a couple of questions. First was, for the benefit of those watching, can you highlight if there are any provisions for the construction of fences between yards? I know that was a certain issue bubbled up last year with a rather large fence, and the resident realized that we actually have nothing in place to curb very tall fences or ones that encroach very close to the law line. Anyway, I'm wondering if there's anything in place for that, and if you could highlight that. And then I've got two other quick questions. I'll leave that one first and then go to my next one after this.
Richard?
Yep, great question. And through you, Your Worship, there are new provisions in the general provisions section, so section 4 of the community planning permit bylaw that deal with fences, and it's specifically section 4.7. And we think they're going to help in that situation, but again, they're new. So if there are any comments, we're happy to receive them and to work on that also.
That's great. Thank you for that. And my follow-up was back to the discussion about tree removal. And I'm wondering what kind of consultation has been had or could still be had with some of the arborists in the area. Because I found that when I had a really conscientious arborist to my property, he enlightened me on which trees I should cut. And I was under the impression, well, I don't really want to cut any unless I have to. But he highlighted how to better manage the forest, there are some trees that we just simply should take down. It was a total learning experience for me. And it's contrary, I think, to public common wisdom that all tree removal is bad tree removal. But anyway, my comment would be is, can we have some outreach? Because clearly this is one of the biggest topics. Can we arrange some outreach with some of the arborists on just further tightening and getting the best possible regulation that we can before we sign it into law?
David, were you going to take that one, or?
Sure. Through you, Madam Mayor, to Councillor Wiebe, I think that's a great idea. I think we can certainly. I can't say for certain that we've received specific comments from any arborists. I know that we haven't reached out directly to arborists as a group, certainly, but I think that's actually a really good point to consider, and that we should definitely do so. And if you I think you mentioned an arborist at your place, if if you want to encourage this arborist to get in touch with us, please do so. But
I'll send everyone I know to your desk.
okay.
Okay. I don't see any other hands. Oh, yes, I do. Councillor Schumacher.
Sorry, just lastly, I was going to say, if we look at sort of communication, Richard, maybe tapping into some of the social media posts for like what's happening in Port Sydney and Utterson, getting sort of the feelers out when it comes to those using the chamber in Port Sydney to sort of maybe get out to their constituents in more rural area, just to kind of address maybe some of those concerns.
Okay. I see no other hands, so I'm going to, now that all comments have been received, I declare the public meeting to be concluded. And I have a resolution moved by Councillor Withey. Councillor Withey, you're still with us, right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Moved by Councillor Withey, seconded by Councillor Fitzgerald. Be it resolved that confirmation bylaw 2021-08 be received, numbered, and read a first, second, and third time, and finally passed this 27th day of October 2021. All in favor? And that carries. And just before I read the motion to adjourn, thank you so much, Richard. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, David. Thank you, Annie. Thank you. There was somebody else on the line a few minutes ago too. Anyways, thank you everyone for your hard work and for having answers to all the questions that were asked tonight. I have a resolution moved by Councillor Stone, seconded by Councillor Armour. Be it resolved that we do now adjourn at 8:06 p.m. All in favor? And that carries.